already said, hello and welcome. This is the first in our first session in our weekend of discussions commemorating the 90th anniversary of the Spanish Revolution and Civil War. These events are organized by Black Rose, Rosa Negra, Anarchist Federation, and sponsored by AK Press. Black Rose, Rosa Negra is the only national scale anarchist political organization in the US, and we're currently growing. If you're organizing in your workplace, in your apartment building, in your neighborhood, or on your campus, and you're looking for a political home to strategize with other revolutionaries and sharpen your skills as an organizer, then we would ask that you reach out. You can visit our website at blackrosefed.org. As well, AK Press is sponsoring this, as I already mentioned, and they're sort of the preeminent anarchist press in the United States, as well as in other countries. And they've done us a very big favor in helping present this series of events. And they've also generously donated $50 in store credit. So at the end of this call, I'm going to randomly select someone to get $25 of that store credit to be applied in their store. So stay on till the end if you want to be eligible for that. Okay, so what are we doing here? Our goal with these discussions is, yes, to look back on the world-shaking events of 1936 and the heroism of millions of men and women who threw themselves into the fight, both against fascism and for the transformation of their society. But we aren't just looking back on these events as a historical novelty, as a short but glorious period of time contained in history books. No, we believe that there are lessons here still to be extracted and applied to our present world, especially at a time in which the forces of reaction are on the march globally. So my name is Cameron. I'll be facilitating the discussion today with Danny Evans. Danny Evans teaches history at Liverpool Hope University. His first book, Revolution in the State, Anarchism in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, was published in paperback by AK Press in 2020. He's written several articles, blog posts, and translations about the history of Spanish anarchism, and he co-hosts the podcast ABC with Danny and Jim. So welcome, Danny.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me, and thanks everybody for attending.
Great. All right. So the run of events today, or the schedule that we're going to do is we'll ask some questions to Danny, and then we'll spend about 30 minutes at the end doing a Q&A. So if you have Q&A questions or questions that you want to ask, submit them. You should have an option somewhere on your dashboard to submit written questions, and we'll get to those at the end. So let's dive right into the questions. The Spanish Civil War and the Revolution were the result of a really complex and dynamic conjuncture of events and social forces, none of which really emerged spontaneously in July of 1936. So let's start by setting the stage for what led up to that moment, with the understanding, obviously, that it's impossible to cover everything in a brief answer, even in an hour-long time that we have today. Could you give a brief overview of the state of Spanish society in the early 20th century?
Yeah, I can give it a go. So I guess with all of these questions, I'm trying to answer at a general level, and hopefully leaving plenty of time for questions. So if people want to dig into specifics, then that would be, that'd be great. I'd be very happy to go into more detail on things. But in the meantime, I'll try not to go into too many tangents. So Spain at the beginning of the 20th century was, I guess, a second-rank European power, but with a very strong, or dominant, even kind of cultural memory of itself, of its own, of its past grandeur, right? So right at the end of the 19th century, it lost its remaining two its most prestigious remaining colonies in Cuba and the Philippines in 1898, which cemented or confirmed Spain's decline as an imperial power, and prompted something called El Desastre, the disaster in Spain, where not just like the ruling classes, but intellectuals um, and sort of professional classes across Spain began this period of like kind of introspection, wondering what kind of like country Spain was. Um, so what we'll try and answer that question. So it was a country of, I mean, it's a cliche, it was a country of contrast, and partly that's illustrated by the fact that it's a decline in geopolitical power, but with this like contrasting idea of itself based on its like imperial past. Um, it was paradoxically sort of re-entered the imperial game at the beginning of the 20th century, not through its own conquest, but because the United Kingdom gave it part of Morocco as a buffer, and gave it a part of Morocco as a colonial protectorate, to act as a buffer between Britain and sorry, French and German imperial interest in North Africa. So even when it like kind of regained this idea of itself as a kind of imperial nation, it was really only at the convenience of the United Kingdom. Um, it then got embroiled in war with the peoples of the Rif in the Spanish side of Morocco, which lasted for a very long time. And the conscription that resulted from this war prompted an uprising in Barcelona in 1909, which brings us to another like of the contrasts of Spain at this early period. In that one of the most striking things about this uprising was the burning of churches. And there's a very famous panoramic photograph of Barcelona in 1909 with all these plumes of smoke throughout the city from all of these churches that were being burned um, during what was known as the Semana Trágica, the tragic week. So while you've got this extremely strong anti-clerical feeling in Spain, like ferocious anti-clerical feeling that went not just was not just on the revolutionary left or by any means, it was like stretched across more or less all of like progressive, like what you could call progressive thought, right, from the far left through to sort of moderate liberal reforming tendencies. And at the same time, you have this extremely strong and powerful church, Catholic Church, which was also absolutely key to a lot of Spain's understanding of itself, like understanding what it meant to be Spanish was coterminous with Catholicism. So that was like alongside this like very strong anti-clericalism, as I say. You also have this big contrast between industrial areas and rural areas, a big contrast between like rural areas. So, I mean, to this day, like Spain is a country of very contrasting geographies and land uses, climates, and this was noticeable in, you got big differences between like these industrial centers in the north, like Bilbao and Barcelona, which were already like industrial cities early on in the 20th century, and big landed estates with absentee landowners where people lived in pretty much feudal conditions in Andalusia in the south. You've got a lot of like places that in between there as well, where it's neither one thing nor the other. So lots of industrializing cities with a mate with whose outskirts were still very rural. So Zaragoza would be a good example of that, which is industrializing at the beginning of the 20th century through things like railways and sugar mills, but which still like on the outskirts of it is basically rural. There's obviously linguistic challenges as well. Spain doesn't have like a particularly unified, dominant political culture or ruling class in this period. Before the Civil War, already in the 20th century, there had been two changes of political system. So in 1900, Spain was a constitutional monarchy, but with a kind of sham democracy, where the two major political parties, conservative and liberal, literally took turns to govern. I mean, I know that's how it often is in democratic systems, but the system was called El Turno system. So it's like they didn't even try and hide the fact that they were just taking turns. And then that came to an end in 1923, and Spain became a military dictatorship, still with a monarchy, until 1931, when Spain became a democratic republic, which was highly anomalous in Europe at that time. You think in the early 1930s, the general tendency is towards where there are changes in political regime, political system, the tendency is towards like authoritarianism, militarism, fascist dictatorship, and so on. So Spain's like pretty anomalous in that context in 1931. And that was way less brief than I'd hoped it was going to be. So sorry. I'm going to stick to the idea of being brief with subsequent.
No, that was great. It's great, great background. I think it's necessary, again, to get a deeper understanding, gain a deeper understanding of these events. So as we're moving up to this period, to the eve of the Civil War, let's turn to the groups, the organized sort of, again, organized social forces that were involved in what would come to be known as the Revolution and Civil War. Some of these existed, many of them existed prior, of course, to the Civil War. So if you're at this event, you probably see the protagonists of the Civil War and the Revolution as the organized anarchist forces. So, of course, with like focus on those groups, we want to hear about those. But maybe if you could sprinkle in some of the other ones, the other prominent forces that were involved, that were either gestating or already fully formed on the eve of the Civil War. Where'd they come from? How are they organized? Again, I know it's a broad question, so maybe focus on the anarchists, but yeah, whatever you want to share.
Okay. So, well, from the anarchist point of view, the most important organization was the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, or CNT, the National Confederation of Labor. So this was a revolutionary trade union organization. It was founded over the course of 1910, 1911. Its early years were marked by severe repression. So more or less as soon as it was founded, it was made illegal. But it really grew during the years of the First World War. Spain was neutral during the First World War, which is really, I think, crucial for understanding its subsequent history in the 20th century. I mean, I guess we can get into that later if people are interested in that idea. So the CNT grew during those years of the First World War, and then in particular, it after the Russian Revolution, right, which has this inspiring effect on the left worldwide, basically. And in that period, so 1918, 19, it really became a mass organization, reaching a peak membership in 1919 of nearly 900,000 members. And at the same time in that period, 1918, 19, it clarified what its end goal was, which was comunismo libertario, or libertarian communism, um, which I suppose is like this practice of revolutionary unionism with this end goal of libertarian communism is what really, I suppose, what anarcho-syndicalism is naming, right? That combination. So as an organization, it tried to guard against bureaucratization and against the possibility of becoming a vehicle for formal politics. And it had been that's from the beginning, right? From its like inception in 1910, despite the fact that it wasn't like a sort of it was organized by coalitions of anarchist socialists and things like this. In 1910, it wasn't like a kind of the brainchild of anarchists exactly, right? 1910, 1911. I guess we could talk more about the relationship of anarchism to the CNT later on if you like. Definitely by 1918, 19, it's clarified its goal as an anarchistic goal, right? Libertarian communism. But from the beginning, even before that, it was trying to guard against bureaucratization and absolutely against becoming a vehicle for formal politics. So it did that by keeping paid members to an absolute minimum, and also committing its unions to direct action. And what's meant by direct action is like unmediated struggle, right? So that obviously that could take many forms, but in the case of revolutionary trade unionism, the main thing it means is that there's no mediation to end disputes. So when workers are on strike at a factory, say, it's the workers directly against the bosses, and they're the ones who have to sort out whatever the solution is. They don't accept the state stepping in or political parties stepping in to resolve those issues. So the growth of the CNT, like, and particularly with like the fear generated by the Russian Revolution among like the ruling classes worldwide, caused a reaction amongst employers, particularly Barcelona industrialists, who hired gunmen to take out leading activists. there was a response in kind from activists within the CNT. So they formed action groups for self-defense and targeted assassination. And this epoch, like so really from sort of 1920 to 1923, maybe 1919, 1923, is known as pistolerismo, um, pistolism, I suppose, we translate it as. And that era came to an end in 1923 with the military dictatorship, which I mentioned earlier. And so that puts an end to that period of like an open warfare on the streets, um, which was mainly concentrated in Barcelona, but had spread by the early 1920s to Zaragoza as well. Um, so the military dictatorship comes in. The CNT as a whole wasn't made illegal in that period. I think I say in my book that it was made illegal because it's like one of those things that you just see all the time that it was made illegal, but actually wasn't made. It wasn't formally banned throughout the state, I don't think, at any point, but its existence has been more or less impossible in most of the state for most of the time. So some like newspapers were allowed to publish, and sometimes like union headquarters would be allowed to stay open in like certain towns and things like this. But it would really depend on like the sort of local politics of that area. Um, but the main sort of story for the CNT was having to go underground, like hundreds, thousands, sometimes members in jail, in exile, or like working in the underground. Um, And in that period, in the 1920s, there was a worry that leading members of the CNT would come to prominence in the previous like 10 years were drifting towards kind of moderation. And there was a worry that there would be some kind of accommodation with the state, with the military dictatorship, to allow the CNT to function legally. So like the leaders would maybe make some kind of compromises that would allow the CNT to be given like some sort of like civil or what's the kind of word, like but basic liberties to organize and collect union dues and all those kinds of things. So the militants who were concerned about that started to network to try and like safeguard what they saw as the anarchist essence of the CNT. And those kind of networking efforts eventually gave rise to the formation of this second major anarchist organization of this period, the Federación Anarquista Ibérica, which is the FAI. Everyone calls it the FAI, right? So that's what I'll be referring to throughout the talk as the FAI. That was in 1927. So that's an organization of anarchist affinity groups which are coordinated at a local, regional, theoretically peninsular level, right? So the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain. But although Portuguese activists were quite important in its formation, its activity was basically national, was mainly restricted to Spain. And Portugal had also become a dictatorship in the 1920s. So those are the two main organizations at the outset of the Republic, which I mentioned earlier, when Spain becomes a democracy in 1931. It's the CNT and the FAI are the two main anarchist organizations. And really, the CNT is much, much bigger than the FAI in that period, in 1931. And as soon as the CNT was able to raise its head above the parapet with like the return to normal legal organizing in 1931, it grew very, very quickly. Grew to, 500,000 members or so, very, like within months, and there was a massive strike wave across Spain to try and take advantage of this new political opening. But alongside those two organizations, CNT and the FAI, there were lots of other manifestations of libertarian strength in Spain, which had a long history, right? Decades long. So free schools. I should have mentioned earlier, right, that the state of education in Spain is important. Education was dominated by the church, and most people, especially before the arrival of the Republic, had very little formal education. Like most of the militants that I look at, probably had 3 years education, maybe four, and then they would start work. Like lots of the activists that you read about, they started work at age 8 or 9 or something like that. So free schools was a lifeline that anarchists were involved in, as well as like an opportunity to promote what they saw as like a rational, kind of non-religion dominated education. Ateneos, so like cultural centers, excursion groups, like lots of excursion groups, which was had this double thing, right? So on the one hand, the anarchists really, in this period in particular, really emphasized getting out in the fresh air and things. You can imagine like especially in context of industrializing terrible quality housing and all that kind of stuff, that it was very important for people to go out into the countryside and have fresh air and things like that. But also, this was a great opportunity for clandestine organizing and like meetings and propaganda and things that all went alongside these kind of country walks, basically. Also, neighborhood associations, anti-eviction groups, and loads of publishing ventures, like loads and loads of magazines, newspapers. It seemed like you know, wherever there were four anarchists in an area, there would be like a magazine or a newspaper to go with them. And then in the years leading up to the Civil War, so during the Republic and the first half of the 1930s, this anarchist world gave rise to new formations, new organizations, which are probably worth mentioning. So you have the Libertarian Youth Organization, the Federación Ibérica de Juventudes Libertarias, which is the FIJL, which again supposedly was peninsula wide, but was mostly actually national in practice, and was always called Juventudes Libertarias, so just Libertarian Youth in Catalonia. So there was a semi-autonomous youth organization within the anarchist youth in Spain. And you also have the formation of like women's groupings. Again, like they have there's a prehistory to those women's groupings before the Republic, but in the moments just before the Civil War, they're able to extend coordination between themselves, especially groups in Madrid and Barcelona. And then more or less at the outset of the Spanish Civil War, you have the formation of Mujeres Libres, or free women, which I guess Martha will be able to talk a lot more about tomorrow. But again, it's like a really important um, element of the anarchist organizing in this period. Also during the Republic, you had the old action groups of the 1920s were reconceptualized as defense committees, which had a greater level of organizational oversight and coordination in the second kind of incarnation in the 30s. Yeah, I don't know whether to talk about other organizations or to talk about the anarchist movement like on the eve of the Civil War, perhaps.
Yeah, I think I think getting a sense of the anarchist movement on the eve of the Civil War, and then obviously you don't have to give a ton of detail about other organizations, but maybe just for the sake of I assume there's some level of familiarity. If you're on this call, you probably know a little bit about the Civil War, but maybe if you could just mention other formations that were relevant, whether outside of anarchism, that were going to play a particular role. I think that the sort of famous ones that everyone are familiar with are the, like the POOM and UGT and others like this. But obviously there's a whole host of acronyms that we maybe would get bogged down in if we spent too much time, but maybe the most prominent ones would be useful to know about.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So on the eve of the Spanish Civil War, the CNT could probably lay claim to about 500,000 members in Spain. And the UGT, which was their main rival trade union organization, which was connected to the Socialist Party, had about the same. So they had about half each of the what you call the organized working class. Um, yeah, I'm not going to go into more detail on that. So yeah, that was important. Yeah, as Cameron mentioned, there was the POOM as well, which was a pretty important organization. It wasn't like massive, but it was fairly significant in Catalonia, especially outside of Barcelona. It didn't have too much strength in the city, but in Barcelona, exactly. But in the towns of Catalonia and in rural Catalonia, had a bigger base, particularly in Lleida, which was a pretty important Catalan town. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I could talk about the Pooh more if you would like me to, but they were uh, they'd originally the two main organizations that had come together to form the Pooh. Pooh was only founded just before the Civil War began, and it was caused by a fusion of two organizations, both of which had their roots in the Communist Party. So the actual leaders of those organizations had been founders of the Spanish Communist Party, but they'd found themselves on the outside. They were opposed Stalinization basically. And so they were like the PUM was an anti-Stalinist organization, wasn't Trotskyist. Um, but there's there's lots of details going into there if you're interested. There was also the Spanish Communist Party, which was relatively small in Spain. It was kind of squeezed by the persistence of this big anarchist organization on the one hand, and the continued like strength of the Socialist Party on the other. I mean, I think that's partly where like when I mentioned Spain's neutrality in the First World War, so important because Spain's labor movement hadn't had that shock of like having to support or go against its own government as had like all the belligerent countries in Europe, and it was out of the fragments of that kind of crisis of socialism in Europe that communist parties have been formed. And that crisis basically just didn't exist in the same way in Spain. So the Communist Party hadn't really been able to gain momentum, um, even before you get onto all the splits and Stalinization that happened there. So the Communist Party was relatively small at the beginning of the Civil War. It became much bigger over the course of the Spanish Civil War, I guess for reasons that we can get into. But yeah, so the CNT had been through like this quite traumatic period in some ways during the Republic, periods of repression. They had had like these attempted insurrections at various points as well, and it had had a major split. So one other party that you could mention actually is the Partido Sindicalista, the Syndicalist Party, which was led by somebody called Ángel Pestaña, who had been an important leader of the CNT right up until like sort of 1932. But most of the people who had been on his side of the split actually came back just before the Civil War. The CNT had this massive congress in Zaragoza 2 months before the Civil War began, where they reunified from the split that had taken place, and they also had an item on the agenda which was how should we define libertarian communism, which was an amazing thing, right? Because they had over 100 submissions from different union branches up and down the country. So, I mean, even if you allow for the fact that some of those unions probably, would have had meetings of like the most active members rather than like assemblies of the whole membership, you're still probably talking thousands of working class people with hardly any formal education in a revolutionary organization talking about what the future revolutionary society is going to be like, debating it and putting forward the proposals and feeling it as a possibility, like as something that's hovering on the horizon for them. Um, I mean, like you think, like you contrast it with like Lenin, right? Like Lenin did that. That's what State and Revolution effectively is, right? The book he wrote just on the eve of the October Revolution. He wrote this, he wrote down his thoughts about what Marx and Engels had said about the state and the Paris Commune and all this, and how that impacted his own ideas about what a revolutionary state should be like. And that was one person, before the October Revolution. The CNT, there were thousands of people. I mean, I think it's like a completely unique thing that any revolutionary organization has ever done. It's amazing. So, I mean, lots of historians kind of like play down like the CNT's strength or like overemphasize the internal uh, um, like disputes that had happened and things like that. Um, but I mean, it's hard to know what it's being compared to. Like it's I mean, compared to any other like revolutionary organization you can think of in history, I mean, you'd have to say it was in a kind of amazing position, really, in a pre-revolutionary situation. To have that level of like organization and sort of revolutionary imagination being mobilized among its members, it's amazing.
Yeah, that's very, very unique and to have, yeah, like you said, thousands, tens of thousands of working class people directly debating and discussing the theoretical content of their organization's program and the future society, like you said, that they want to build. It's pretty unique, unfortunately unique. It would be better if it wasn't a unique historical thing, but it exists as something that we can hopefully contribute to recreating some version of that. So let's move on now to the Civil War and the Revolution in particular. And I think, of course, we want this. This question is about what actually precipitated the actual like events that precipitated the Civil War, and what kind of proceeded immediately after that. So an overview of that would be helpful, but maybe and then maybe at the end, because I think it becomes a more relevant question as the events unfold. But there is this central question of whether or not the Civil War and Revolution are two separate things that are taking place, and whether one takes primacy over the other. So that's, I think, a relevant dimension here to address beyond just a recounting of the facts of what took place. So maybe if I know it's a lot to ask for one question, but maybe if you could recount some of those events and then also speak to why, even in the way I'm framing the question, there's a division between these two things, and if there should be.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'll do my best. So the Civil War was precipitated by an attempted military coup on the part of right-wing generals in the Spanish army who were veterans of the Moroccan Wars, and they were backed by other right-wing forces. So there'd been like a conspiracy that had really accelerated with the victory of an anti-fascist coalition, the Popular Front, in elections of February 1936. So there's an attempted military coup in July, by which point the leading conspirators, particularly General Mola, had had sort of solidified the support of certain right-wing factions, religious or fascist character, basically, and they'd also secured the support of Italy and Germany, which was going to be very important. Um, so it's a military coup. What turns the coup into a revolution and a civil war is the resistance of the main working class organizations, especially the CNT, to the army. Um, Now, this is something that the mainstream historiography of the Spanish Civil War these days plays down, right? And emphasizes that emphasizes the protagonism of loyal members of the police and things like this, and the army, and there were right members of the armed forces and the police who opposed the coup, and they did play an important role in many cities in terms of putting the coup down. But in general, their contributions were effective only when the workers' organizations had already taken the initiative. And so when those organizations were hesitant or passive, the coup was successful. Right? It's never the case that the protagonism or initiative of of loyal police or army stops the coup in any area, right? It's always that the police and the loyal police or loyal army officers or whatever are able to join a battle that the workers' organizations are prepared to give. And much more common is the story actually of places where the workers' organizations are just left on their own to fight or not, and yeah, but anyway, back to the revolution and the civil war. So in those areas where the coup was suppressed, so that's like most of Spain's major cities actually, right? So Barcelona, Madrid, Valencia, Malaga, Gijón, Bilbao, all those places the coup was like put down. And in all of those places as well, committees were set up to coordinate anti-fascist forces. Within days, militia columns were formed, which were normally attached to unions or political parties. Sometimes they would be mixed from the start, but in most cases they were organized specifically by unions or political parties. So it was very clear that it's very clear to all the protagonists, I guess, from very early on, right, from I guess a maximum like about 48 hours, that there was a revolution and a civil war going on simultaneously. So it was obvious that there was a civil war going on because news was coming from other places that the coup had been successful in other places. So you had this situation where the country, the territory was divided. But it was also obvious that a revolution was happening because, and this is another reason why that mainstream historiographical point about the role of the police and the army and stuff doesn't really make sense. It's because everywhere, in all of the places where the coup was suppressed, with some exception, like one or two exceptions, basically like Bilbao in the Basque Country, the workers' organizations were totally dominant in those areas. You couldn't get around cities or in between cities without safe passage signed by workers' organization. Um, I mean, that doesn't normally happen after a successful police operation. It's obviously the opposite of that, and there was a kind of like revolutionary carnival taking place. There's to a greater or lesser extent, right, depending on specific like local political cultures and things. But definitely in places, in lots of places, you have people like burning money, like taking money out into the street and burning it. Um, the police sort of disappeared from the street and armed workers replaced them. Armed women, right? This is in a country where like it had been like basically rare to see young women unchaperoned on the street, suddenly like carrying rifles around, and wearing overalls, workers' overalls. Churches are burned. There's like macabre aspects to this. Like they go into like the churches and or like monasteries and dig up tombs and bring skeletons out and put like these like skeletons out on the streets and things. Um, Prisons demolished. Um, the women's prison. Like they went in Barcelona. They went to the women's prison, freed all the prisoners, and then they held an assembly outside on the street to decide what to do with it, like whether they should like turn it into a school or something, or whether they should like demolish it. And then they decided to demolish it. And then they just had a debate about whether they should demolish it themselves or like get some like the builders union in to do a controlled demolition. And they got the builders union, and there's actually photos you can see in the I mean, if you can navigate Catalan website, you can go onto the Arxiu Nacional de Catalunya website, the National Archive Catalunya. I'm pretty sure it's there. And they've got a photographic archive. I can't think of the name of the photographer now, but there's a collection of photos of Civil War era Barcelona, and there's a photo of someone from the Builders Union with a pickaxe demolishing the women's prison. So amazing. Um, so loads of buildings were taken over. The CNT headquarters in Barcelona was in this big old Employers Association building, which is still there. It's huge. If you ever go to Barcelona, if you've ever been, it's if you think you're looking at the cathedral, and there's a square to your left, and over that square is a main road called the Via Laietana. And on that corner, just near the cathedral, is this huge building with a kind of panoramic sweep of the streets in front of it. Um, which was called the Casa Cambo. And two teenage anarchist women went in there with pistols during the street fighting and said, this would be a really useful building for us to like occupy. Apparently, they were extremely polite to like the porters and everything like that, who were also like quite accommodating. And but that was like the start. Like they expropriated that building, and then it became like the headquarters of Catalan anarchism for like the rest of the Civil War. The poshest hotel in Barcelona, the Ritz, was taken over and like run as a workers' canteen. Like anyone could just go along and like have silver service like dinner. I mean, obviously that can only last as long as the food supplies are plentiful and everything. But I mean, no one would question that there'd been a revolution. It was everywhere in the kind of like immediately visible physiognomy of the city. Um, and not just in Barcelona actually, in very similar scenes taking place in places like Malaga and in towns as well where there'd been a strong like revolutionary presence, not even necessarily just anarchists, like in rural towns where there was a strong like idea about what would happen when the revolution came. There was a, like going into like the town hall and burning all the records, like burning money and all that kind of stuff. Um, and then there is like the material changes in social relations, right? So workplaces taken over. I mean, the bosses basically disappeared, from lots of places. I mean, some were killed, some ran away, like some were absent, like industrialists who didn't live in the cities anyway. Um, and so, uh, you know, worked more or less kind of had to take them over, but were ready to take them over, fitted within the imagination of like how the revolution was supposed to take place anyway. Um, committees were set up to coordinate food supply. I mean, that happened like straight away as well. Um, in the countryside, regular assemblies became part and parcel of organization of like life in villages and things like this, deciding how work was going to be distributed and all that kind of stuff. Land was collectivized. Was famously, well, within the anarchist scene, it's kind of famous, the collectivizations that took place in Aragon, particularly in areas that were liberated by the anarchist columns that were moving towards Zaragoza in the first like months of the Civil War, and which were very significant. But also, land was collectivized in around Jaén and Andalusia, in Castilla-La Mancha, and places like that. Places where there hadn't necessarily been very high implantation of anarchists or the CNT previously, but very significant, profound revolutions. The border as well, right? The border between Catalonia and France was basically controlled by anarchists for the first 11 months of the Civil War. And they attempted to operate the border policy based on principles of anti-fascism and internationalism, which is unique. It's like we're used to thinking about the border as a place of like death, aren't we? And authoritarianism, and they tried to turn it into something completely different. It's the opposite. Yeah, so yeah, I would say that it would, for anyone who was involved in that period, in that process, the Civil War and the Revolution were absolutely part and parcel of the same thing, right? And then, as the Civil War went on, and the revolution was pushed back in the name of like winning the war. It was very common for like revolutionaries who were trying to defend the revolution to to make that argument, that they were by defending the revolution they were also fighting the war, as in their conception of it. And they thought there was a kind of brazen hypocrisy about the people who were pushing the revolution back were people who had been passive or invisible during the actual street fighting and stuff. Which is like an important polemical point. It wasn't necessarily true in all cases, I guess, but yeah, that was definitely the perception that revolutionaries had. Yeah, for sure. Um, yes, I don't know if this is a good point to move on to the next
Yeah,
question or
this
not.
is this is great. I mean, I think, and you covered with the questions we had prepared, I think you covered a little bit about the process of revolution and what that really looked like and how it manifested. And I think, yeah, the picture you painted was really great because it talked about both the institutions, but also the transformation of everyday social relations. That's I'm sure people will want to hear more about it. But again, given our time constraints, and if we want to get to some Q&A, I think we should probably move on to the last question, which is the kind of crux of your book or the focus of your book, which is on the state and really the attempt to vanquish the state. And as your book focuses on the eventual reconstruction of the state. Oftentimes in the kind of, I think, when people are giving a gloss of the Civil War, if they have some understanding of it, at least if they're coming from a perspective that's sympathetic to the anarchists, there is a tendency to kind of cast all the blame toward the PCE, the Communist Party, and the Comintern aligned groups in Spain for having, kind of cut off supplies, demobilized, made it impossible to wage the war, continue to wage the war, and that ultimately is what led to the defeat, not only of the kind of organized anarchist forces, but also of the Republic. But you present a kind of a more complex version of this history, and again, especially with respect to the state. How did collaboration and bureaucratization come to grip the kind of higher echelons? This is really a story too about the anarchist organizations themselves that became bureaucratized. How did that happen, and how did that contribute to maybe a calcification, an inability of them to operate in a way that would have possibly ensured the fulfillment of the revolutionary ideals, but also the potentially the success of the Civil War? And what groups were involved in trying to, prevent this from happening, prevent the bureaucratization from happening. And of course, again, the context here being that this is all these conversations, these processes are all going on while the Civil War and Revolution are ongoing. This is happening in that moment. So if you could condense everything in your book down to a 10-minute answer, that would be great. If not, people got to go out and buy the book. But I would love to hear as much as you can tell us about the things that I just mentioned.
Yeah, okay. So I guess in terms of like bureaucratization, I'm gonna I think it's that's one of those words in it where people use it a lot, and I suppose I've used it a lot, and then I think, do I really know what that means? Maybe I don't. So like if I say like what I mean by that, normally I guess is like a separation between the kind of leadership group or like the representatives of an organization and the rest of the people in it. Okay. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. Yeah, yeah,
okay, cool. Um, so yeah, so you can describe that process, and I suppose it's like relatively easy to describe how that process happens or is accelerated in the Civil War. I guess it's much more difficult to think like, why does that happen exactly? Um, I suppose I'll try and like do both. Um, I mean, there was some degree of bureaucratization evident in the libertarian movement before the Civil War. Um, and I don't really know if if it's ever possible. I mean, this is what I mean by like, the complexity of it, like because there's if you have a situation where like being a militant or being like having a role in the CNT, say, um, or having a role in the FI, like being a secretary in the FI or something like this, um, it required a lot from you, and didn't it was not a good it's not a good career move, like anything else. So you're not getting any like at least before the Civil War anyway. The chances are you wouldn't be getting any sort of financial compensation for it, or like minimal, like costs being covered perhaps. You'd be really taking a risk, right? So the chances of you being like blacklisted from work, the chances of you being like attacked, maybe shot, like definitely arrested. All the like activists that I look at, they've been like to jail numerous times. They get arrested, like, all the time. Lots of times they have to move, for organizational reasons, like out of like places that they know and things like this. So like this kind of strain that it would put on like your family life or personal life and all that kind of stuff is massive, right? So to some degree, like even if you have like all of these like checks and balances to try and prevent bureaucratization, um, it's likely that only a minority of people in your organization are actually ever going to want to like take on those kind of roles. And so like the most committed people are going to be like the kind of people who take on those roles. And I would suggest like a high chance of those, of some separation starting to be evident between like a certain layer of like militants and the broader like mass, like kind of almost inevitably, right? So you have people who have like lots of like experience, um, in terms of like negotiations, in terms of like speaking in public, or in terms of like writing in newspapers, or of keeping organizations going in conditions of clandestinity, who have contacts with abroad or have contacts in other cities and things like this. And obviously not that's not going to apply to everybody. So like those people are going to like be given like the organization is to some extent going to depend on those people taking on the roles that they can do, right? They're capable of doing. And then in the context of like civil war, where decisions have to be made very quickly with like a very high degree of urgency with life and death, um, then it's it seems like almost like a kind of natural process. I'm not trying to say like there shouldn't have been like some effort to like prevent it or something, for that for those people to start taking on those kinds of responsibilities for themselves and start making those decisions without the same kind of deliberative assembly-based processes that they were supposed to, according to the norms of the organization as they'd existed. Um, so, I mean, if you take a big question, right? So, like the CNT joined the national government in November 1936 for anarchists, or yeah, I mean, you'd have to say that they were all anarchists. joined the national government, which is, became ministers in a national government. Um, so how that decision took place, it was brought to national plenums. So those are not like congresses of the organization where every member gets to discuss and debate it and things, but like the kinds of decision-making forums that existed in between congresses. Um, so there was a degree of like grassroots democracy involved in those national plenums taking place. Um, and there were at least two that took place where the question of the CNT possibly collaborating with the government was discussed prior to the CNT actually entering government. But in both cases, if I'm remembering rightly, I'm pretty sure this is the case. Not all the delegates were able to attend, right? You can imagine like how difficult it was to travel around like Spain in this moment. But also like where in both cases delegates like complained about not having received the agenda in time to discuss with the broader membership and all that kind of stuff. So even with those kinds of caveats that uh, decisions were being taken by reduced numbers of people, even then, the people were complaining that they hadn't been able to even discuss it with them, with those that reduced numbers. And even then, there wasn't a green light, there wasn't an unambiguous green light for collaboration or joining the government. And certainly not on the terms that eventually happened, or certainly not the individuals that were put forward and things like this. All of how that actually ended up happening was pretty opaque and outside of like the normal processes. I mean, I guess like at these plenums, the sort of like the national coordinators and things thought, okay, we've got enough of a sense that people will go along with this. We'll sort out the actual details ourselves, kind of thing. I think that's sort of what happened. But definitely the broader kind of assembly-based processes weren't taking place. And also you've got like the fact that while national plenums and regional plenums continue to take place throughout the Civil War, there wasn't a mechanism for representing militia at the front. So a lot of the most active union members and activists and militants left their workplaces to go and fight at the beginning of the Civil War, and weren't able to have their voices heard through their old like unions. I mean, I guess like potentially they could have like sent like letters and things back to the unions to have that brought up, but it was difficult. And when it was like suggested that there be a formal mechanism for militia being represented in these plenums, it was rejected. Um, and then like over time, like that like those smaller groups of people who are making these kind of decisions start to formalize their own leadership role, right? And cement, and in this way, kind of bureaucratization gets cemented because you have like committees set up who are, are then like sort of create kind of brick walls with other members of the organization, um, try to impose like a line, a single line on, on the press or on uh, effectively trying to stymie the autonomy of the membership, try and like introduce greater discipline, organizational discipline, essentially. And you have like specific bodies set up to try and do that and try and enforce it. Um, Opposition to that, yeah, because you did ask about opposition, didn't you? Right? So like, so what my book tries to do is like chart the opposition to this essentially, or opposition in particular to the process of collaborating with the state. Um, by the end of 1936, there was notable discontent in the libertarian movement, which could be seen in various phenomena and sectors. So, defense committees, which I mentioned earlier, um, had a key role during the Republic, and in particularly in the street fighting that put down the coup, tended to be quite radical in their composition, and concerned about the direction of the movement. Concerned also about their own members having their weapons taken from them by police in the rear guard. So that was a key issue. Libertarian youth. So the youth wing of the anarchist movement tended to be pretty critical of the drift towards bureaucratization. There were several radical newspapers that cropped up from the end of 1936 through to the spring of 1937, in different regions, in different areas of Spain. Lots of union branches were trying to like push forward, especially with the program of socialization. So lots of like factories and industries were collectivized at the beginning of the Civil War, which basically meant kind of like worker control in the factories and stuff. But the socialization was seen to be like a way of like creating greater coordination within given industries. So right from the get-go, actually, like some of the industries in Barcelona were actually socialized, and actually beyond Barcelona as well. So transport as a whole industry was like effectively run by the CNT. Um, the woodwork industry, the leather industry, they were all socialized. And socialization was generally seen as like the next stage up from collectivization. It was more desirable. It would cement like working class power, um, and make the like a sort of socialist economy more effective, basically. So there was a big campaign from the end of 1936 through spring of 1937 to push forward with socialization. So a lot of these like kind of debates were happening at union level as well. The local Federation of Anarchist Affinity Groups, so like the shorthand for that would be the Barcelona FI, became increasingly radical in this period as well. So in like the sort of say 6 months or 5 months from December 1936 through to May 1937. There were connections between Mujeres Libres and this like process, connections between Mujeres Libres and food riots in Barcelona that were led by women in response to the increasing price of essential food items. And there was a big prisoner solidarity campaign. As you get this like phenomenon of anarchists being arrested at first, like it's like individual cases that become like very important. Like Maroto from Granada, who was arrested, who became like a big cause célèbre in the anarchist movement. Unfortunately, over time, like more and more anarchists start to be arrested, so it becomes a whole thing. The anarchist prisoners. So prisoner solidarity was a major area in which like that kind of the CNT leadership or the libertarian movement's leadership was kind of contested. And there's also opposition to militarization at the front. So it's like a very wide-ranging phenomena. Then in spring 1937, the Friends of Durruti was formed, Los Amigos de Durruti, an association that was intended to serve as a kind of pole of recruitment, um, making the kind of criticisms that have been made across the board in all of those different arena, but doing it, I suppose, under a sort of single banner of the Friends of Durruti. So this had been originally founded by members of the Durruti column who had refused to militarize and return from the front. There's about 800 of them. And the most famous like figures of that group, sorry, were Pablo Ruiz, who had been a long-term member of the CNT, probably joined around 1914, was definitely involved in strikes in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. And I'm pretty sure his first name is Francisco Carreño, who had also been in the war committee of the Durruti column. So I've been friends with Durruti, who was a famous anarchist who was killed in November 1936. And then the other outstanding figure that's, well, a best known figure from amongst the founders of the Friends of Durruti in Barcelona was Jaime Barrios, who was mainly known as a kind of a radical journalist. He'd trained as a doctor, so from a different sort of class background to the majority of the CNT membership. And this is like used against him in a very snide way by Paul Preston in his book, The Spanish Holocaust. He refers to him as like a wealthy Catalan nationalist, which is like just wrong, like he'd basically given up the possibility of having any sort of comfortable career. I mean, he did that by becoming a Catalan nationalist actually in the early 20s, but wasn't involved in that for very long. Because once he was imprisoned for his activity as a Catalan nationalist, he became so he basically met workers in prison who radicalized him in that kind of direction. But he's like a lot of these figures. Well, all of the figures associated with the Friends of Durruti have had a lot of like slander heaped on them. sadly by by anarchists at the time. Um, yeah, so they became to initially, I mean, like what the Friends of Durruti put forward in their initial kind of manifestos and things were very similar to wouldn't have come as a shock to anyone. It's like stuff from the Zaragoza Congress, plus stuff was what was that was already happening in terms of the Civil War and things that were being said by anarchists in all these like lots of different arena. The thing that they became known for came a little bit later, just before the Barcelona May Days of 1937, which was this idea of a revolutionary junta to replace the regional government of Catalonia. Um, and it's I guess the junta is seen as the innovation of the Friends of Durruti, but it's not immediately obvious, I guess, like whether that how like novel that was, right? Because you'd normally translate junta as like council, and like there would be a junta of the transport union, for example, uh in the Barcelona CNT's transport union. And the CNT itself, as a kind of the official policy of the CNT in September 1936 had been that instead of like having a national government, there should be a junta. Or, well, they didn't say junta or anything; they said consejo. It's another word for council, um, which would be formed by the unions, like the CNT and the UGT, which was like I guess their way of getting around the worry about being involved in government. So you'd have like this like kind of a governing council. So I've seen some analyses of the Friends of Durruti that say this is a recapitulation of that idea, basically. Um, but Balius himself, in like his journalism, said that it would be an elected body. So that brings up different kinds of possibilities, I guess. But anyway, I guess we can talk about the Friends of Durruti. I mean, the thing that I found in my book that interested me and was kind of exciting to me when I first like started researching it was that resistance to these processes went way beyond like the Friends of Durruti, and although I do think the Friends of Durruti is an important formation and things and very interesting, and I'm still like wanting to learn more about them. Um, I do think it's important to like bear in mind as well that the actual opposition to bureaucratization within the CNC and opposition to collaboration went beyond that, and there were quite a number of militants, I guess, who were like maybe sympathized or maybe didn't with the Friends of Durruti, or maybe thought that like they were going about things in a way that they were like not particularly comfortable with in certain aspects, but shared their essential concerns and desire to defend the revolution. Um, I guess I'll leave it there. I mean, I'm
Totally.
very happy to talk more about it and answer
I
questions.
absolutely. Again, there's so many. It's such a dynamic. I mean, it's an understatement to say that this is a dynamic few years. There's so much going on all over the country, right? And so you could, I mean, to do any justice, we would have to, I think, spend um, quite a long time talking about these things. But I think you did a great job summarizing much of it. And I think that was our last kind of prepared question. So thank you, Danny, so much for spending your time with us, your evening with us. And thank you, everyone. There's people from all around the world on the call. So thank you, everyone who spent your Saturday, whatever time it is for you, with us. Yeah, thanks so much. Listen to Danny's podcast, ABC with Danny and Jim, and check out Danny's forthcoming work. He mentioned that he's working on something that's coming out soon. So stay up to date. All right, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you're at.